Hey guys, how you going? This is BillyEatWorld again, and in today's video we're going to take a look at something a bit different because, as you guys probably know, I'm really interested in World War II history, and I think one of the most interesting things about this period is how far the technology progressed. And when it comes to military technology of this time, I think most people would probably agree that Germany really was the leader in a lot of respects, and especially when it comes to small arms. And so that's what we're going to get into today. I want to give you guys a brief history of German World War II infantry weapons, and especially the ones we have available in Battlefield 5. Alright, so to kick off, if you're not too familiar with World War II, well, probably the first thing you need to know is that it all took place between 1939 and 1945. So in other words, only really about 20 years after the end of World War I, which up to that point really wasn't a long time when it came to the development of firearms technology. What that meant was, just like what happened at the start of the First World War, when World War II started, most countries were preparing to fight the previous style of war. And remember, the First World War was largely a static war of attrition fought in trenches that hardly moved for months or even years. Now, in World War I should mention that pretty much all of the major nations relied on bolt-action rifles as their standard issue infantry weapons. And for the German Empire, well, they used the Mausergewehr 98, which at the time was a very reliable and accurate rifle with a 5-round magazine. It served from 1898 to 1935 when it was replaced with what was basically a shorter, more updated version called the Kar 98K. And this was what went on to become the standard issue infantry weapon of the German Wehrmacht during the Second World War, with around 14.5 million being produced up until 1945. Now, like I said earlier, before the Second World War started, most nations were preparing to fight a war similar to the First World War, but the German perspective was always going to be a little bit different. Because geographically, at the start of World War I in 1914, Germany and its allies were essentially surrounded by enemies, and they knew they'd need to win the war quickly if they hoped to win it at all. As it turns out, they never really had a chance because armies were ground to a halt by new technological developments in artillery, machine guns, and barbed wire. But by the end of the war, technology like tanks were being developed and introduced to counter the stalemate, and the era of mobile mechanized warfare had officially begun. By the time the Nazis came to power in the mid-1930s, German military strategists were starting to lay the groundwork for probably the most well-known of mechanized doctrines, Blitzkrieg. And basically, in a nutshell, what this involved was using tanks organised into armoured spearheads to quickly punch through the front lines and encircle enemy forces. One of the existing small arm types that definitely wasn't going to fit in with this new mobile doctrine was machine guns, which up until that point were usually water-cooled and mounted on a heavy tripod. And so from 1929 onwards, Germany had begun to develop a lighter, more portable, air-cooled machine gun mounted on a bipod that had eventually come to be known as the MG34. Now, as revolutionary as this new light machine gun was at the time, the biggest issue with the MG34 was that when war broke out, it was just too complex and too expensive to produce. And so, although it did still serve as a vehicle-mounted machine gun throughout the war, it was eventually replaced in 1942 by the cheaper MG42. Not only was the MG42 lighter and cheaper to build, it fired at an insanely fast 1200 RPM compared to 850 of the MG34, or around 600 of comparable Allied machine guns. And so not only was it very effective as an area denial weapon, it also had a psychological effect on Allied troops, who, after the sound it made, nicknamed it Hitler's buzzsaw. Now, with that being said, that wasn't the end of Germany's search for a more portable machine gun though, because even more mobile than the Panzer divisions were the new Fallschirmjäger paratroopers. And as you can imagine, it's probably hard enough to jump out of a plane into a war zone as it is, let alone while you're trying to carry a 12-kilo machine gun and its ammo. The German solution was to develop an even smaller, even lighter, shoulder-fired machine gun called the FG42, which was also introduced in 1942. And even though it fired the same cartridge as the MG42, this one only came in at around 5 kilos, and it fed from much more portable 20-round detachable box magazines. Now, when you take a look at these characteristics on paper, the FG42 probably technically has more in common these days with what we'd call an automatic rifle than it does with, say, a light machine gun. But back in the World War II era, a true automatic rifle would have been something more along the lines of the standard issue weapon of the US military, the M1 Garand. Unlike the Americans, like I said before, the Germans never actually adopted an automatic rifle as standard, but they did eventually introduce a rifle called the Gewehr 43 into military service. And the big difference between this weapon and the FG42 was that it was a bit lighter, it only fired in semi-auto mode, and it used smaller 10-round detachable magazines. All in all, though, the Gewehr 43 was still, for all intents and purposes, a much more suitable weapon than the Kar 98 for the battlefields of World War II. But even then, it was still reasonably big and heavy, and it became pretty clear after a while that a lot of the time full-sized rifle cartridges were just overkill for the sort of ranges German infantry needed to operate at. Now, to make up for this, by the time the G43 did hit the front lines, Germany was already issuing close-quarters weapons like pistols and the MP40 submachine gun to officers and NCOs. But the issue is that they basically suffered from the opposite problem of a full-sized rifle, because as they only fired pistol ammunition, they were really only suited to short-range engagements instead. Now, here's where we get to the most interesting part of the story, which is when Germany figured out that what they really needed was something in between the two. They needed a lightweight, portable select fire weapon that fired a cartridge somewhere in between a full-sized rifle round and the pistol round of a submachine gun. And their solution to this problem was in 1943 to introduce one of the very first assault rifles called the Sturmgewehr, as well as a true intermediate cartridge. And even though it only reached the front lines in the last few years of the war, it was actually so effective that the German High Command chose to develop it in secret, even though Hitler had specifically suspended all new rifle development programs. Now, the issue is that by 1943, most historians would agree that the outcome of World War II was basically already a foregone conclusion, and Germany wasn't going to win anything. And as the end of the war drew closer, Germany's industry was being bombed into ruins, and so in 1945 they had no choice but to introduce the much less impressive Volkssturmgewehr. And I think of all the guns on this list, well, this is the most interesting because in a lot of ways it's similar to the Sturmgewehr in that it shows how far small arms technology had progressed up until that point. But as you can see, it's almost overly simplistic. It's designed to be as cheap and easy to produce as possible. And it's a great place to end this story because it's really representative of how desperate things must have been in Germany in those final few months of the war. But anyway, guys, obviously that's not the end of the story for every weapon that Germany used in the Second World War, but that is where we're going to finish up this video. And so, as always, make sure you let me know what you thought about this video in the comment section below, and if you've got a favourite weapon that we talked about today, make sure you let me know that as well. As always, though, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and please feel free to check out the links in the description if you want to see any more of these videos. And also, don't forget you can find my Twitter and Discord links down there as well if you want to keep in touch. And as always, until next time, see you later, and have a good one.